Good evening, everyone. I'm Lisa Carrico, Program Director for the Missouri Humanities. We are a member-supported organization, and our mission is dedicated to enriching lives and strengthening communities by connecting Missourians to the places, people, and ideas that shape our society. Thank you for joining our virtual roundtable. Tonight's discussion is part of our 2023 signature series, Roots and Routes, the Movement and Settlement of Missourians. Throughout the year, we'll be hosting public programming and digital content related to the movement of people into and out of and within the state, examining how both chosen and forced migration and how historical changes in transportation continue to inhabit and shape the region. Tonight's panel of speakers combines varying areas of expertise, differing perspectives, and diverse backgrounds to help answer some stage-setting questions as we get deeper into our 2023 Roots and Routes programming. Our moderator for tonight is Dr. Sudarsan Kant, an associate professor of political science at Harris-Stowe University. His research interest is in the politics and economy of small islands, especially in the areas of economic development and democratization. His current project is looking at how climate change will affect tourism in the Caribbean. He currently serves on the board of the Missouri Humanities, and we'd like to graciously thank him for volunteering his time tonight to lend his expertise to this discussion. We would like to thank everyone who submitted a question before registering for the program. We had many thought-provoking submissions, and we did our best to incorporate as many of them as possible in a broad sense of looking at some of the biggest shifts in migration patterns and how the movement of people have impacted our state. If you enjoy this program and would like to learn more about our signature series, including already released Roots and Routes podcast episodes and video content, visit mohumanities.org/movement. And while you are there, we invite you to click the Get Involved link at the top of our website to learn about upcoming events and membership opportunities. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Sudarsan. He will start us off with a brief introduction before introducing our panelist. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome. This is a great program that the Humanities, Missouri Humanities is hosting. It's about roots and routes. And as we know that we Americans are a restless people, we are defined by a yearning for change, for freedom, and home. We pacified a vast continent and transformed the backwaters of the New World into an imperial power. But the price of our restlessness have sometimes come with costs that are too painful to acknowledge and sometimes inconvenient to situate within our preferred narratives. Take, for example, the iconic St. Louis Arch. It is at once a celebration of the westward expansion of these United States, as well as a symbol of the tragedy that befell indigenous Americans who stood in the way of that expansion. Missouri Humanities opens this new series on roots and routes and invites all of us to reflect on our search for home and our longing to establish roots and find our place in the new world. As citizens of a country which is born of many nations and communities, we project our various histories and traditions in an ongoing conversation between the places that form us and the places that we form them. Our speakers tonight come from different disciplines and perspectives, and we hope that what we have to share with you tonight will provide you with a new lens to see how far we have traveled and appreciate the different routes each one of us has taken, as we have done so in the past, and as countless Americans will do so in the future. So we welcome you tonight. We welcome our panelists. First up is Molly Butterworth. She started a museum career and began nurturing a love for vehicles in high school. as a volunteer at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. She followed up with degrees from Miami University and a master's in public history from Wright State University, in a career that has included roles as a curator and director of the Museum of Transportation and Historic Building Preservation at Faust Park. She has also written 2 books and several nationally published magazine articles in the field of transportation history. Welcome, Molly. Next up is Dr. Sandoval. Ness is a professor of demography and sociology at St. Louis University. He has been conducting research at the intersection of demography and computational spatial science. His research focuses on geospatial data science methodologies to study socioeconomic demographic patterns in American cities. We have Cicely. She has a bachelor's in arts and history and political science with a minor in Africana studies from Marquette University, a master's of arts in American studies from St. Louis University, where she is currently working on a PhD in American studies. She currently works as the public historian for the Missouri Historical Society, where she shares St. Louis's Black history through a variety of public mediums, including exhibits, online initiatives, and public presentations. And then we have Jim Duncan. He's an archaeologist, educator, author, and Osage scholar, and has served as director of the Missouri State Museum, exhibits director for the Missouri Transportation Department of Conservation, and directed the 3-year statewide programming for the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. Jim has lectured at Washington University, the Missouri History Museum, and throughout the state while on the Missouri Humanities Council Speakers Bureau. Welcome. So before we begin our discussion, let me throw out a general question. When we talk about routes and routes, when we talk about the movement of peoples, how do we define settlement? What does settlement mean for people coming in to a particular place where either it's empty or those that have been coming into a place where there are other inhabitants? How do we define settlement? Ness?
Happy to go first. Thank you again for the invitation to be part of this great panel. From a government perspective, settlement is defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. And so they have different definitions of what a settlement is. It can be what they call a census designation place. So it can be a small village, it can be a suburb, it can be a principal city. So that's typically the way most people think about their own geography. So they can say, I live in this town, St. Charles, Chesterfield, or I live in this village of 500 people. But that name typically comes from the US government, and it's recognized by the government as being official. Now, there may be other official, how people understand their own geography, but that's one way that we define settlement across the United States that's uniformed.
And does anybody else wants to jump in there? Okay, when we talk settlement, we generally talk about, as you said, geography, a specific location, a place, but settlement has also implied oftentimes as, for example, settler colonies. Settlement has also implied unwarranted expansion. How do we look at settlement in the context of, say, in the United States? Like when we talk about the movement of peoples, does that also mean the movement of peoples that had to leave a certain place because a group had come in? Are these uncomfortable, sort of patterns of history that we have to think about in our imagining of place?
I wonder too if we need not consider only imagining of place, but also of time and context. I would think possibly settlement as defined by the indigenous peoples of this nation, of the state of Missouri, differs from settlement of Irish Americans within the hill of St. Louis. I think certainly the context of time and place, as well as the needs of those people settling and the technology around them, then, think about the supply of food and materials to build living places and so forth. Those were certainly different in the horse transportation years than they were in the railroad and then finally the automotive and aviation years. So certainly I think settlement has a tie to time, place, and people here within the state of Missouri.
I think
You mentioned indigenous Americans. Let me ask you this, Jim, how do you even begin to recognize the place of Native Americans in Missouri? Why has there been such a, paucity of scholarship, memorialization, and acknowledgement of indigenous peoples in Missouri? What's the
original inhabitants of the state of Missouri, the largest group, of course, were Siouan-speaking people. And of those, that largest group, of course, it was the modern-day Osage. Along with them, there were the Missouri and the Quapaw, related, and they were principally hunters and intense agriculturalists. And as you know from the large archaeological sites, particularly Cahokia, East St. Louis, and then Mound City, about 1,000 years ago, it was the largest concentration of people, one of the largest in the world. It outstripped London. There was a population at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi River that was greater than that existing in London at the time. There were cities in, of course, China, India, that were much larger. But we're looking at, and this is fairly general, as far as indigenous people in Missouri, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000. And of course, with a center, and I know when Dr. Sandoval brought up the settlement question, these centers were not quite urban in the sense of modern urban. They played a great part religiously, and of course, you have to think in terms that the people did at that time. And it was literally the navel of the world for them, the center of everything that mattered.
When we talk about, the indigenous Americans, we also have to think about what specific were indigenous Americans, what role did, say, our natural geography, like a river, like the Mississippi or the Missouri River, play in the establishment of these of indigenous communities? Were they situated around the rivers? What role has the river played, the waterways in the state of Missouri?
Well, they were the most important avenues of travel, the waterways. And Missouri certainly has its share of rivers. It's interesting that Missouri is nestled between what they call the Prairie Peninsula, the glaciated peninsula extending down from the Great Lakes, the Ozark upthrust, forested area, karsted, lots of springs, many, many small streams. So what you've got is a biologically or biodiverse area. And of course, those of us that study this sort of thing, this is the best place to settle if you're going to be a sedentary population that is engaged in both agricultural pursuits and hunting. And an interesting fact I want to throw out, most of the world's population today off of agricultural plants discovered in the Western Hemisphere by indigenous populations. Maize, it's the foremost food plant in sub-Saharan Africa. So the food plants that were developed in the Western Hemisphere are among our most important. Northern Europe, the potato, papas, that's South American. All of your peppers. And interestingly, these plants are closely related. A lot of them belong to the deadly nightshade family. That's why you can't eat certain parts of a potato. You can't eat a potato root if it's green or poison you. So it's a very complex issue. And if you've ever seen illustrations of the earliest explorers and the American Indian indigenous people, one group in particular, the Spanish and the French, two groups, you'll find that the Native Americans are depicted about a head taller. They were certainly well-nourished. They had very good, almost a Garden of Eden, particularly that central Mississippi Valley.
Let me ask you this question, Molly. The river obviously has played a very significant role in the history of Missouri. I mean, we are synonymous, the Mississippi. And it was important when it was the main conduit for transportation of goods and services and people. What happened? What's the new modes of transportation? How has it affected the state?
As you mentioned, certainly the rivers played a pivotal role for both our indigenous peoples. As we look at the European immigrants, the number of French who came north from New Orleans on the Mississippi River, their strong influence on southern parts of Missouri alongside the river and everything, that river in particular was certainly a critical role player in the European immigration settlement of the, especially the western side of the river here in Missouri. But as technology and transportation developed, the rivers became a slow and ponderous way to travel. First, of course, here in the gateway city with both the indigenous peoples as well as the European immigrants, horse and wagon. That was a critical role player for people moving west from the gateway that we had become to settle in the plains and the western states. That held on, as did the rivers themselves, until the introduction of the iron horse, of railroad power. The ferry boat companies here in St. Louis, and I'll point my finger most directly at the Wiggins Ferry Company, held on to the power they played in transporting people and products over the Mississippi River from the Illinois to the Missouri side. They held on to that power so long that they were actually able to delay the construction of a railroad bridge. We now know and recognize the Eads Bridge as a pivotal part of St. Louis's history, especially when it comes to transportation. Had they not pushed off the development and construction of that bridge, it's very possible that St. Louis might have been the great city of the Midwest, as opposed to Chicago, which got a jump on us financially because they had that railroad transportation available to them in the 1850s. We didn't really have the ability to cross the river until the 1870s. That pushed us behind. And then, of course, the iron horse became slowly replaced by the freedom provided by the automobiles. So as the technology and innovation of transportation vehicles, as well as the building of infrastructure that supports those vehicles flourished, the rivers became seemingly ever slower and more expensive on which to ship people and goods.
When we're talking about transportation and the movement of peoples using those modes of transportation, let's talk about the Great Migration, Cicely. Tell us about that. Tell us about the Black Exodus and the Great Migration of the people of African-American descent that came to Missouri.
Yes, so I'll begin with the Black Exodusters. So they also came by riverboat, and some came by wagon as well, but most of them journeyed along the Mississippi River, specifically coming from Mississippi as well as Louisiana. And this is roughly about 1879. So that's when the huge groups of Black folks are coming from the Deep South into essentially their promised land, which was Kansas City. Oftentimes they would stop in St. Louis along the banks, of course, and there were groups here that were willing to support, especially Black communities who were here, who galvanized, made sure that they were able to purchase tickets along their route, and that sort of thing. So there were huge swaths of folks who were coming in, specifically around 1879 to about 1880. And then we see the progression continue. Then we talk about the Great Migration. So this is another time period in which you have folks coming from the South into the West and into, the East and into further north, essentially. And their whole goal was to essentially build communities to get out of the depths of the South, which were in some ways holding them hostage, right, from the life and the liberty that they hope to pursue. This was not just, Black men, for example, but this was families, right? This was Black men, women, and children who came together. When I talked about the Black Exodusters, typically it was around $4. That's what would get them here to St. Louis. And then from there, if they didn't have the means, that's where I was talking a little bit about the Black community supporting their journey with providing them with clothing, with food, with shelter, until they can make that next journey onward to Kansas City. And it was even said that each man was essentially his own Moses, so to speak. So that really speaks volumes to how important it was for Black communities to come in and to seek that liberty and the pursuit of what they pursued as freedom, right, that they hoped for. So that's just a little bit about their experience between those different time periods.
There's a great question here from one of our audience. It says, what was the attraction to Kansas City for Black people coming from the South?
Yeah, so there were a few folks who were self-emancipated, of course, and there were some folks who were coming from the South and journeying further north. And Benjamin Singleton was particularly one individual who recruited a lot of folks saying, you got to get out of the South. You got to get out of the South, because there were three main primary factors. People typically talk about them as like push and pull factors. Essentially, it was economics, right? There was, since, they're coming out of the Civil War timeframe, they're emancipated. But what ends up happening is they become sharecroppers. So they don't have ownership of land, but they're working the land. The other thing is that there were political constraints. So if they wanted to vote, Republican, for example, they were actually brutally beaten and violence and things of that nature. They were called bulldozers, essentially would come in and disrupt families, kill families and such. So a lot of them continue to pursue like, hey, we got to get out of the South. This is not the life that we thought that we would have. The other thing was just personal safety, right? Just to be able to live freely, right? It was essentially what drove them. So those three push and pull factors really contributed to the movement of Black people from the South.
Here's a question, Ness. Let's talk data for 1 second. Are we having net migration in Missouri? Is Missouri a growing state population-wise? Is it a destination for?
So So in demography, we look at 3 transitions: births, deaths, and migration. So if we just look at births and deaths, Missouri's in a demographic winter, which means more people are dying than are being born today in Missouri. And so they've been in a demographic winter for 2 years. Part of it, this is driven through the pandemic. We just have excess of deaths in Missouri. We do have some people moving into Missouri. About 13 people move to Missouri every day, but that's nowhere near where it's happening in other states. So for example, in Texas, every day, 633 people move to Texas every day. If I just take a North Carolina, 273 people move to North Carolina every day. So we're not that destination of North Carolina, Texas, Florida, where you have hundreds and hundreds of people moving every day to the state. And so when we look at, I think we have to think about why we're not that destination like these other states. This is the last year of data. The nice thing about being a demographer is we get updates almost every 6 months on what's happening for migration. Every month we get reports on births and deaths. So we have a pretty good demographic pulse of what's happening in the state and what's happening in almost every county, every city in the region that make up Missouri. So we have a pretty good sense of what's happening and what the future looks like if nothing changes from a migration perspective.
What is the future?
I think the future, so we're a state that has, we're a little bit older. We have an older population in our state. So we're going to continue to see deaths in our state, right? This is just a demographic fact. And fertility is declining pretty rapidly in the state. And so we're able to project this out for 20, 30 years. And so if we don't get a huge increase in migration, you talk about the political reality of what may happen. And the reality is we will probably lose a House seat if we don't get migration into the state, because we can no longer grow naturally as a state. We have more people dying than are born. So our ability to grow naturally is gone. So the only way we can grow as a state is through migration. And 13 people a day is not enough to maintain the political power that Missouri has as a state. In 30 years, 40 years, that political power will go to North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, Arizona. When you look at these states that are growing, it's pretty phenomenal. I'll just give you one demographic fact. There are more babies born in Houston, Texas than the entire state of Missouri every year. There are more babies born in Dallas than Houston, Texas. That's the demographic fact of what's happening in Texas.
Jim, let me ask you a question that's I've always thought about. How is it that we have such a rich history of indigenous Americans, but we have such a sort of a lack of history about them? Why is there such a lacuna in our understanding of our own state?
Well, this has a long history, Dr. Kant. You're familiar with the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Yes.
It was in effect long before 1830. Indian removal began when the first Europeans journeyed across the Atlantic Ocean and began to exert something. I guess the best word for it is imperialism. And in the case of Missouri, of course, it was the home of a pretty good sized nation out of the 258 nations that the federal government recognizes. One of the things that helped a great deal was disease, particularly smallpox, rubella, and others, simply because the American Indian population, they're basically Asians, Asian immigrants that probably have a history of at least 25 to maybe even 30,000 years in the Western Hemisphere, and they are isolated. So when smallpox was brought, and give you an example, Hernandez Soto, when he brought his expedition to what was called Florida, and that was North America in general at that time, he had a huge herd of swine, horses, war dogs, soldiers, etc. They didn't do as well militarily as they had expected to. In fact, that expedition was a failure. However, it was a vector for smallpox. So that by the time LaSalle descended the Mississippi River, traveled south from St. Ignace, the great grand down the Mississippi River, most of these large settlements, villages, and they were fortified. They had palisades, they had bastions. These villages were seen as late as the early 19th century. American Indians were protective of their territories, and they did fortify their villages. If you visit Cahokia, you'll see the wall and the bastions. The English said, of course, in their settling of Virginia, Jamestown, the American Indians were the finest light infantry in the world as far as warriors. Likewise, the Spanish recognized them as being the greatest horsemen, the Comanche, in the world. So they weren't an easy push. However, with the Indian Removal Act, that was legally making it illegal for an Indian to live in Missouri. That law was still on the books back in the 1970s. So what they did was remove them to reservations. And sadly, that's a settlement pattern that Indians still today tend to be reservation centered. So the trick is you get rid of the Indians. You either do it by military force, as they did in the Northwest Territory. That's the Ohio Valley. So it's really, it's been a policy of move the Indians off their prime real estate and put them on reservations. And the Indian Territory, of course, was Kansas and Oklahoma. All the Indians east of the Mississippi River were moved to the Indian Territory in 1830 with the Removal Act, as well as, well, the Osage were moved there in 1808. They were told they would either have to fight the United States or they would accept $2,500 trading station and a blacksmith and farm equipment for their state, Missouri, and the northern half of Arkansas.
Jim, now that we are, we've had a complicated relationship, to say the least, with the indigenous Americans. Well, here goes something for you, Cicely. We've also had a complicated relationship with African Americans. I mean, we were a slaveholding state that was still part of the Union. Our legacy goes all the way, from a long history from Dred Scott to Shelley versus Kramer, and even in recent difficulties. How do you define the Black experience in Missouri?
So I will only speak to St. Louis. I'm gonna that's my area of focus, is St. Louis specifically. I would say it's multidimensional, it's complex, it's a story of agency, a story of labor, intensive labor, slave labor, of course. It's a story of mobility. It's a story of complexity. It's a story that combines a lot of different things. It's not one. What I really am trying to say is it's not one singular experience. And so you get stories about civil rights, right? That even stem back to Charlton Tandy, who was also helping migrants. He was one of the reasons why, when these Black exodusters were coming into St. Louis and as a stopping place, some oftentimes did settle here, but others continue forward to Kansas. But it was people like him and others that really helped assist and pave the way for others. It's a story of neighborhoods. I see one person had mentioned, talk a little bit about Mill Creek Valley. Mill Creek Valley, I mean, to this currently, what's St. Louis University, where their campus is located, where the soccer stadium and that sort of area is located, that was a rich community of over 20,000 Black folks that you cannot see a footprint really of what that neighborhood consisted of. It was a story of, you know, Black businesses, schools, churches, you name it, it was there. We can also talk about the Ville, for example. There are so many stories that we could talk about as it relates to Black experiences here in St. Louis, and it's a complicated one, but nevertheless an important one to dive into, because it really shows how even through the midst of all of these different hardships, that there was beauty and there was Black joy and there was, you know, the rallying of collective action and so forth. So it's complex, and it shouldn't be pigeonholed to one particular experience, because it's so much more nuanced than that. So.
Well, you know, you mentioned, Cicely, when you focus on St. Louis, you know, and this question is really, you know, see if Molly and Ness can jump in. We understand, you know, what Ness is saying about, you know, this really sort of the ebb and flow of population and growth in a particular, you know, different states. You know, I guess it's boom time for, you know, Georgia and Texas at the moment. What roles, you know, do our urban areas play? You know, whether it's Kansas City or St. Louis, or whether it's Springfield or, you know, Jeff City, what roles do these play in sort of creating, you know, an environment that's attractive and flourishing and bringing in people with its diversity and its energy?
Well, I can speak certainly to the role the manufacture of transportation vehicles has played here in the St. Louis area. If you look going back to certainly everything from railroad construction, we had passenger railroad car and steam locomotive builders here in the St. Louis area by the 1850s. We continued to draw as we moved into the automotive age. You know, at one point we had all of the big three here, Chrysler and Fenton. We had Ford and Hazelwood, General Motors in North St. Louis, including the beloved Corvette plant. We had other big builders here, St. Louis Car Company, building passenger and freight railroad equipment, as well as streetcars in North St. Louis. The city itself was not only a great transportation hub, being, you know, the gateway city once again, it was also a great manufacturer of transportation vehicles. It drew employees, corporations in for that. It supported those businesses for decades. We all now know that most have left St. Louis, either have closed those plants or moved to other plants, or have seen their businesses shrink. And certainly that has had an impact in a number of ways on St. Louis, from demographics to population numbers to economics to everything, you know, our culture, our art, our music, everything. So we can see we rode the great waves of transportation, both up and I'm afraid now down.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So cities have always been very important places for people to imagine what a region's like. So you can think of Los Angeles, and you can think of what it's like to live in Los Angeles, or Miami, what it's like to live there. And so when people think of St. Louis, they think of the arch, right? This is the city. And so these in Kansas City, you can think of these places of creating an imagination of what life may be like in those cities. But what's happening, and we're going through this experiment live across the United States, is migration typically was always connected to employment. And so when you move to St. Louis, you move to get one of these jobs at GM, or you move to work at Boeing, et cetera. But what's happening today is we're seeing a shift in the types of jobs we're creating. And the types of jobs we're creating does not necessarily require us to move. And what accelerated this was the pandemic, as a lot of companies invested in remote work environments. And so St. Louis, I just looked at this a couple of weeks ago, we're creating lots of jobs. We're creating lots of jobs. So, but the issue is, and we're at this borderline of being a superstar city in the number of jobs we're creating in high tech. But the problem with high tech jobs is that people do not have to move to St. Louis to take them. They can live in Lincoln, Nebraska. They can live in Dallas, Texas. They can live in Miami and have that job here in St. Louis. And so we're going through this experiment where traditionally, if you took these jobs, there was a requirement that you had to live here. And I just read an article today about another major bank giving up and saying, we're not going to force people to come back into work because people don't want to come back. They want to work remotely. And so migration, the way we understand migration is changing as we speak today. Because it was the point that, well, I'm going to move because I want to go to WashU or I want to go to Vanderbilt. I have to move, right? But to get that job at Company X does not necessarily require me to move, especially if I have a spouse that has a job in that city. I have children in school. I don't have to uproot them anymore. And so we're going through this great experiment of Missouri may be impacted by this. We are creating lots of jobs, good jobs, but they're being disconnected from migration.
You're right. I think, there is I think we're still coming to grips with how jobs, opportunities are going to shift in the years after the pandemic. Probably another 10 years from now, we'll see the full impact of what has ensued. But 10 years, it's a lifetime. Cities and communities can, sort of lose population, and dramatically change in ways that we can't even imagine today. The question I want to ask, each one of us is that, what does it mean? What does it mean to, even less than a generation ago, when people were moving to a particular place, say to permanently to settle, they were going to settle they were going to be part of a community. They're going to go, get a home, raise kids, be part of a specific community. If what Ness you are suggesting is that if people are simply moving just to be at a different address, even though they work someplace else, our works, with the places we work and the places we inhabit, are part of a larger picture of community. So what does it mean when we have these divided loyalties? A paycheck comes from one city, one state, whereas a home is in another community.
And another point about this is a really important point, is that the younger generation of Americans, if you were to get this job, I'm going to live in that city for the rest of my life. But the new generation, this new younger generation, they want to experience all of life. And so they may take a job, but it's really for 4 or 5 years. And they want to go to the next experience, the next city. And so this is changing migration patterns. And so a lot of companies have to realize that they're trying to recruit young students out of college, and they'd be happy to get them for 5 years. The idea of somebody saying, I'm going to work for this company for the next 30 years, I think that generation's over. The new generation's like, I'm going to give you 5 years, and then I'm going to go to this city, I'm going to move to this city. And that's just the reality of what's happening. And so, like I said, this is a very important question. And if you're not growing by births, you have to deal with realities. How do you bring people? I saw a comment here where we have affordable housing. Pittsburgh has affordable housing too. And people are leaving Pittsburgh every day. Nobody wants to move to Pittsburgh. This young generation does not want to move to Pittsburgh. And it's just as affordable. It's got great housing. But you talk to a young person today, and they're like, what's in Pittsburgh? Why would I want to go there? Well, I think St. Louis has fallen off that radar, because when you talk to young people from the East Coast or the West Coast, they're like, why would I want to go to St. Louis? What's there? And so we have to kind of deal with the reality of how do we reimagine and tell our story. We have great rivers. We have great environmental capital. I just don't think we do a very good job of marketing what life can be like living with these rivers, living with the green trees. I think what we see on the news is crime, corruption, and that's how people on the West Coast and East Coast kind of view St. Louis.
Well, I'm gonna thank our panel on that note. I think, just in conclusion, there's always the genius about the American experience has always been possibilities and promise, So, and, we can imagine a place where we can establish our roots, but we can also, this is the paradox, we can also imagine mobility. We can not only socioeconomic mobility, but also the ability to move to someplace else, which is quite unique in many parts of the world. Generally, people, they stay put in a particular place for generations. So, I once, somebody once said, that, I'm in Florida, but I've never met anybody that was born in Florida. Now, don't say this, I'm just saying that there's so many people that come from outside of Florida to establish community in Florida. That's the genius of the American experiment. I do believe that I think Missouri has, like Ness has said, has immense potential. We are a rich, vibrant state. In both in its history, as Jim has pointed out, both in our ability to overcome our difficulties and keep on progressing, as Cicely has pointed out, as well as our ability to be an important area for transportation and expansion, as Molly and Ness has pointed out. So I think there's great possibility and great promise in the places we have been, in the places we, as in the state, established roots and community. I thank you, each one of you, for being part of this panel, and I'll hand it over to Lisa, and she'll conclude with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sudarsan. We still have a few minutes before my final conclusion. There are so many great questions in here, several that have been answered via text with Cicely and Ness, so feel free to scroll through those and through the chat. There's been lots of personal stories that have been shared on people's own migration in inhabiting Missouri. Something that I did want to address as a statewide organization, so hopefully someone will feel comfortable to address this. We have talked a lot about the city, so somebody does want to know what's happening in the population of Missouri's rural areas.
I can just talk demographically. So for the first time, when the 2020 census came out, we saw a decline in rural America, and that's present here in Missouri. We have a project, and people are more than happy to send me an email, and I'm happy to share the link. It's called Demography for Democracy. And we have maps of the entire United States that show births and deaths and migration of every county in the United States. And you can see Missouri is one of these states where when you get outside of St. Louis, Springfield, Columbia, and St. Louis, it's not a very positive story in terms of population growth. You have more people dying than are being born, and you have people leaving. They're migrating to Kansas City, to St. Louis. But this is a larger trend that's happening worldwide, is that people are on the move. They're moving to big cities around the world. And this is something that's happening. They want that urban life. They want access to the amenities, to the education, to the hospital. And so this is going to continue to happen. We're seeing a great reorganization of our metropolitan region.
Yeah, there's a few questions here too. I think that kind of goes in with the rural idea of our state. Taylor wrote, to what extent does the pervasive notion of flyover territory affect settlement and movement? And then also somebody kind of talked about Missouri being kind of the migratory pass through. We've talked about the native removals, the many trails west, the Mormon removal, agricultural shifts, resource depletion, which that we can kind of touch on that too, the environmental impacts and maybe how that moves people. But definitely we kind of touched on a branding issue, but I didn't know if anybody wanted to kind of touch on this flyover idea for Missouri. And we do have our small town showcase project that is highlighting rural towns in Missouri to show the wealth of those communities. So if anybody wants to touch on that.
I can say, I will admit right now, I grew up out of state. I grew up in Ohio, but in an agricultural area, very small town, very, very dependent upon both crop and animal production. I just visited back home a couple of weeks ago, and I see some of the same things happening in our agricultural areas here in Missouri that I saw back home. Many of what used to be family farms for decades, well over a century, have been absorbed by larger corporations and turned into corporate agricultural acreage. Thereby, some of those families have gone. They've left those areas. I have seen a number of those wonderful old farmhouses, barns just falling in and upon themselves, while the land is still used and harvested and so forth. I think that certainly has had a very similar impact here in the great agricultural areas of Missouri, especially from Interstate 70 north. Fewer people, fewer farms, same number of acres, same number of animals and so forth, but fewer people there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the flyover state. I mean, Missouri still it's 19th in the country in terms of population. It's got over 6 million residents. So it's still a very powerful state from a demographic perspective. I think what I found interesting is, as a demographer, I'm always looking for markers of how the state distinguishes itself, was the Super Bowl. Because you had Kansas City in it, and then you had Philadelphia. And it was kind of interesting to see the narrative that, just demographic speaking, I think Arizona was the big winner as a state of how it was perceived as a state of a destination to go. Because if you go back and you kind of look at the narrative, it was Arizona was on the showcase, even though it was not Arizona, but that was the positive vibe there. And it was really about the city, Kansas City, and about the city of Philadelphia, not about Pennsylvania or Missouri. And so I thought that was a kind of interesting take of how that was framed, just in terms of the state profile, and that, yeah, Kansas City is a bi-state region, and so St. Louis, right? But still, I would have thought that Missouri would have got there was some national news about the governor representing Kansas City and the governor of Pennsylvania, but I didn't see more than I thought I would have seen. And so I still think Missouri as a state has a lot of potential. It's got a demographic challenge, though, and I just have to be honest about it. It's an older state, and it doesn't have a lot of minorities in the state, and so it will be in a demographic winter. It's in a demographic winter, and to get out of it, it needs a big influence of migration of Latinos, and it's starting to lose the Black population, and so this is the first time ever that's happened. It's not growing as fast as it historically grown, and so if it starts to lose its Black population, then the state's going to be in trouble. it'll be in trouble 20, 30 years if it has a net loss. Because I think South Dakota's Black population grew faster than Missouri's Black population. And so it is very possible that we'll have a net loss of the Black population at the state level in the next 10 years.
Missouri has a very small American Indian indigenous population. If I want to be with Osages in any number, I have to drive about 420 miles southwest to northeast Oklahoma. So population-wise, there are very few Indians in Missouri, and there are no reservations. So that's one of the things that it's kind of sorrowful. We have some of the, I think, most beautiful forests, the Ozarks, the Missouri River, the Northern Prairies, a wonderful state. There just aren't many Indians in it.
Well, we are close. Ness, is there anything or anybody else want to add about kind of what they kind of see the future of our state's demography to look like, or things that you might just be kind of excited about?
Yeah, so I like I said, I think as a demographer, we are very rich with data. We have pretty good pulse. This little thing here, that's my iPhone. We can track demographic changes because most people keep their phone number now. And so we have pretty good algorithms that tell us whether a person has moved into a region and if it's a temporary or long-term move. Where students are coming from, if they're on their parents' plans. So we're in a really important age of being able to really precisely track migration and try to understand, is it temporary, is it permanent? What role do universities play? Businesses. So I think we're gonna have a pretty good sense, just as good as the birth and death records of getting a sense of how many people are actually coming here to permanently live, coming for jobs, coming to retire. And I think the young people is just trying to get a sense of all those babies born in Texas. They're not gonna stay in Texas. They're gonna be moving to find the American dream. And so the $20 million question is, how many are gonna be moving to Missouri to make the American dream in these small towns in Missouri, St. Louis or Kansas City? How many are going to come here? Or are they going to be going to Memphis? Are they going to be going to Nashville? Are they going to Charlotte? To me, that's the question. And if we get a good sense that they are going to be skipping Missouri, then it's going to be a big warning saying for Missouri that we're going to miss out on that migration. Because it's the next 30 years is about it. We got 30, 40 years of good migration. And then we just kind of see, because fertility is declining around the US, if we don't get our demographic profile in a better position, the state's not going to grow.
Okay, we are right at 8 o'clock. I want to thank everyone that tuned in tonight. Special thanks to our moderator, Sudarsan, for hosting such an engaging conversation, and to our special guests, Cicely, Jim, Ness, and Molly. Thank you. There is an extensive amount of questions, history, ideas that we could explore tonight. So I know that we've only just hit the surface. So I hope that everyone follows along with us this year for our 2023 signature series as we explore more of these ideas behind roots and route. We encourage you to stay in touch by following us on social media at Mo Humanities, becoming a member or joining our email list on our website at mohumanities.org. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this evening's program and that maybe you feel inspired to learn more about our upcoming programs, but also to search out some of this content on your own and see what you find. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone.